You found the skeleton. How would you tell it to represent? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Oh, hi there. I didn't know it was you. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur, and it'll be $18. Anyway, we're not here for obscure movie illusions. We're here to talk about Grady McMurtry. Grady has so far lied about Darwin, failed to define a kind or information despite talking about them a lot, and also completely failed at basic logic, all while showing a profound ignorance of evolution. Even though, again, he won't define information or give us a way to measure it.
Let me give you a simple little example. What if I were to go down into the audience, and let's just say I go over here on that end. We know that gentleman right over there, well, he's a stalwart, upright member of the community, never told a lie in your entire life, correct, sir? Seems like this is a little sort of a hard sell right here, sir. Don't say anything. Now, if I were to tell him for 5 minutes a story which nobody else in the room could hear, and then I asked him to repeat that story exactly, verbatim, exactly word for word as I told it to him, to her, and then her to her, and then her to him to her, and I go all the way across here, and finally I get over on that end, and I ask her to tell me the story that I told him. How many of you will agree you won't even recognize the country it occurred in? Hello?
Hello. Yes, the telephone game is a widely understood thing. In fact, it's actually pretty similar to evolution in some ways. The story will change with every telling because of the imperfection of human memory, but the human understanding of logic and narrative structure tends to ensure that the story stays more or less coherent at each stage, and by the end what comes out is still a comprehensible story, even though it will bear very little similarity to the initial story.
What happened to the story? Mutations. Copying errors, is that correct?
Yes, more or less.
Or, well, let's think more about mutations as well. Why can't mutations produce evolutionary ascent? Well, the laws of genetics prevent new beneficial information at a higher level of intelligence or complexity from occurring by random chance.
How so? This would require some mutations to simply be blocked from occurring in such a way that all such blocked mutations would be beneficial. But let's take a look at that. Let's say that there's a protein that helps humans digest their food. We'll pick amylase, as humans produce a lot of it, and have multiple copies of the amylase gene which express in different parts of the digestive tract. It's what makes humans so good at breaking down starchy foods like maize, wheat, and potatoes. So let's say that there's a point mutation that breaks the copy of the amylase gene that expresses in the salivary glands. Now, this human can't get as much nutrition out of food like bread, beer, popcorn, potatoes, taquitos, etc. Now let's just say that the mutation was changing a guanine and changing it to a cytosine. Okay, so this seems on the whole like this mutation is probably deleterious, at least in a situation where calories are not abundant. So we'll say that this person is living in a subsistence farming society. Well, now this person and their children who inherit this trait have to spend more time gathering food and eating and less time mating and caring for children. So this family will likely have measurably lower reproductive capacity than those around them. Now here's the question. What prevents cytosine from turning into a guanine again? This would clearly be a beneficial mutation, as it would immediately transform an amylase pseudogene into a functioning amylase gene. That's obviously beneficial. But if there's a law of genetics that prevents beneficial mutations, apparently this back mutation is physically impossible. Further, this doesn't work because mutations aren't objectively beneficial or detrimental. It's dependent on environment. We can look to mice for an example of this. In most environments, mice tend to be dark colored, because that makes it easier to blend in. The agouti gene can result in sandy or straw-colored mice, but also it can result in dead mice where the light color is homozygous. Further, the light color is dominant, so in most populations the light color allele is vanishingly rare, and when it pops up, it is not infrequently a new mutation. But what happens when mice live on and around the beaches of Florida, which have very light-colored sand? Well, now that mutation that was harmful in most places is helpful. So do the laws of genetics prevent a mutation to the agouti gene in beach mice, but not in forest mice? Because in one case it's beneficial, but in the other it's detrimental? That sure doesn't sound like a natural law to me. What mechanism could possibly look at the environment, decide that certain mutations would be helpful in that environment, and then block them, then in different environments, block other mutations and allow what was previously blocked? You see, none of this makes sense when you think about it, even for a little bit.
Think with me for a minute. We copy the previously existing information. You can either copy it perfectly or imperfectly, but not more perfectly. So there is no opportunity to add new beneficial information.
Okay, but we're talking here about the telephone game. And what would make information good or bad? I'd say perhaps whether it makes the story more or less interesting, but that's subjective. But interestingly, we do have a form of natural selection for stories. You see, folk stories are traditional stories that are rarely written down and instead tend to be told person to person over generations. Those stories do indeed change over time, and less popular versions are shared less often and so go extinct. whereas more interesting versions can take over. So if you remove the artificial constraints in a telephone game of only single person-to-person transmission, low numbers of people transmitting the story, and the ability of people to choose which version to pass on, then you sure can add beneficial information. By the way, this concept is essentially the concept of a meme, first developed by Richard Dawkins, in which ideas undergo a process of spread, change, and selection, similar to what organisms go through.
Evolutionists will counter with this argument. They will say, well, you see, that's true, but...
No, they won't. They'll laugh in your face because it's incredibly stupid. Or if they're feeling nicer, they might decide to treat you more like a toddler, because clearly you're struggling to get much more cognitive ability than that. But oh well, let's hear the rest of the straw man.
While on Earth things are decaying, but you see, the sun, it's the sun. The sun's producing all this light and energy going everywhere and so forth, and the Earth just happens to capture a little bit of that energy. And because of capturing that little bit of random energy coming from the sun, it reverses the second law of thermodynamics on Earth and allows things to actually progress instead of go downhill.
I'm sorry, the thing that prevents beneficial mutations from happening is the second law of thermodynamics? You know, that thing that isn't about genetics at all? Well, I guess it's time to talk about the second law out of the blue. So the second law of thermodynamics says that in an isolated system, the amount of energy available to do mechanical work cannot increase over time. It can be held steady, or it can decrease. This is why your car runs out of fuel, why you need to keep eating to not starve, and why batteries run out of charge eventually, even if you don't use them. Now we need to define some terms. Systems in thermodynamics can be open, closed, or isolated. But what's a system? Well, it's whatever we want it to be. You can say that a single organism is a system, a whole planet, the universe as a whole, etc. Basically, it's whatever we're trying to analyze thermodynamically. An open system is one in which matter and energy can be exchanged with the environment. An organism is a great example of an open system. For example, a tree takes in carbon dioxide, minerals, and sunlight in order to grow. A closed system is one in which matter is not exchanged with the environment, but energy is. A computer would generally be a decent example of this. Energy comes in from the outside, but in normal operation, no matter is really added to the computer, and only the energy is used to perform functions. An isolated system is one where neither matter nor energy is exchanged with the surrounding environment. An example might be a closed-cycle steam engine, where a fuel is burned to boil water, which then condenses to be fed back into the boiler. If we don't refuel the system, it is essentially isolated. Now, generally speaking, systems are not strictly open, isolated, or closed. For example, the steam engine is going to shed heat to the environment, but for most purposes, we can treat it as isolated, provided that it's reasonably well insulated from such external heat exchange. So it's important that strictly the second law only applies to isolated systems. This is because mechanical work requires an energy gradient. It requires more energy in one place than in another. You can think of this like a river. Water won't flow if there's no gradient in the terrain. That is, no slope. It's just a pool and it won't go anywhere. Therefore, it's not doing any work. It's not moving sediment, for example. But the steeper the slope or gradient, the more work can be done by the water. In a thermodynamic situation, this is often accomplished by heat. With a hot part of the system and a cold part, you can derive reactions like the steam engine described earlier. But when you use this gradient to perform work, you have to take energy from the point in the system with high energy and bring it to the point in the system with low energy. This lowers the difference between them, meaning that only so much work can be done without adding new energy, either in the form of direct energy input, such as heating the hot point with an external heat source, or by adding matter in the form of some kind of fuel. Note, this does not just apply to heat engines. A gravity engine works thermodynamically in the same way. For example, if you had a large stack of heavy objects, which are lowered by a pulley system to produce work elsewhere, you can only produce as much work as allowed by the potential energy stored in your tower of heavy things. The quantity of energy in a system unavailable to do work is measured by a quantity called entropy. One of the things I want to drive home is how little this has to do with any concept of order, complexity, chaos, or decay. A living human has far more entropy than a frozen dead mouse. But I don't think people would consider the dead mouse a preferable thing to be for this reason, or to be more valuable, or in most other ways better than a living human. How does any of this prevent a mutation from helping an organism reproduce more than its peers? I have no clue. It really doesn't, and even some of the better informed creationists know this. Indeed, Lord Kelvin, who was no fan of evolution and who invented the second law of thermodynamics, did not criticize evolution on this ground.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll excuse me for just a moment. If I, as a teacher in a classroom,
A deeply disturbing thought.
believed that the input of excess undirected energy would accomplish anything,
What does it mean for energy to be undirected? The only thing I can think of is that it's being input into a system in a way that does not allow the system to do more work. For example, if you had a heat engine and added external heat in such a way that you added thermal energy to both the heat source and the heat sink, but kept the gradient between them intact, then you likely would not have allowed the system to do more or less work. So I guess if you directed the heat to the heat source, that would increase the capacity of the system to do work, but equally you could direct it at only the heatsink, decreasing the ability of the system to do work. But also, depending on the physical qualities of a system, simply shoving energy at it could result in the energy adding to the gradient. Basically, to say that undirected energy cannot increase the ability of a system to do work, you'd have to show why that energy cannot go to increasing the energy gradient of the system under any circumstances. Who wants to bet that McMurtry here does no such thing?
I would have all my students stand up, take 2 fingers, lick them, go over to that wall socket, and stick them in. I will now have added excess undirected energy to their system. But tell me something, will it be better for the experience?
No, it won't. Congrats on finding an example of adding energy into a system in a way that does not increase its ability to do work. That was always a possibility. What we need to show to make this argument work, though, is not that it is possible to add energy to a system in a way that will increase its ability to do work, but that it is impossible to add energy to a system in a way that will. Good luck with that.
Oh, come on. Assuming they survive, they're only going to get 2 things out of this little experiment. The first is don't ever do that again. And the second thing is their nervous system will never be quite the same again.
Yes, it probably will. It's entirely possible to survive a shock from a normal wall socket, which in the USA carries 120 volts AC RMS at 60 Hz. I know, because it happened to me, and I have no neurological symptoms because of it. That's not to say you should think it's safe. Even a mild shock has the potential to be fatal, and should be avoided with the exception of medical devices for muscle stimulation, which are extremely carefully designed to avoid danger, but even then, if you put the lead across someone's heart, for example, that could still kill them. Unless you're trained, you should not be using such devices on people.
But think with me. Adding excess undirected energy to a system will destroy the system.
Depends on what undirected means, and how much and of what kind of energy and how fast it is added to the system, and also on what it means to be destroyed. If I boil an egg from the standpoint of a chicken, I might have destroyed it, but from the standpoint of me, who wants to eat a boiled egg, that's an improvement.
For example, in my presentations, I use laptop computers, I use video projectors, but they're made to be used anywhere in the world. I can plug them into a 110, a 220, a 50 cycle, a 60 cycle, it makes no difference. I can use it in Japan, Russia, South Africa, I do it all the time. But I have a desktop computer at home. In the United States, we use 110, 60 cycle currents, and
voltage in US wall outlets started at 110 in the 1930s, but by the 1980s, 120 was the standard, and most devices can tolerate a range of voltages that encompasses both values.
Well, if I were to pack up my computer at home on the desktop, take it with me to Russia, and I do this twice a year, I go to Russia, so if I take it to Russia, and I unpack it, and I stick it in the wall, and I turn it on, in about 1/4 of 1 second, I'll have a piece of fried junk.
No, you won't, because you won't be able to. US plugs don't fit in Russian wall outlet sockets. Russia uses 220 volts 50 Hz power, so if you had a straight adapter that simply replaced the rectangular cross-section leads on the American device with the circular leads of a Russian device, that would indeed cause some problems.
Because in Russia they use 220. Well, what happened? My computer was destroyed because I added excess undirected energy.
No, actually, assuming the use of a basic adapter to get power into the machine, the energy was no more or less directed than before. So a computer power supply is basically a big rectifier, because computers, being electronic devices, need direct current, whereas wall sockets provide alternating current power. A rectifier is a circuit that uses diodes, which also allow current to flow in one direction with extremely low resistance, but have extremely high resistance in the other direction, essentially blocking current flow in that direction. Diodes are like the check valves of electronics. Rectifiers can be as simple as just putting a single diode in series with the circuit, which reduces the full sine wave of an alternating voltage to just 1/2 of the sine wave. They can be more complex bridge rectifiers, which flip 1/2 of the voltage sine wave in a direction and keep the other half. Or they can be even more complicated ones that store some of the energy to give a lower voltage but more constant direct current output. A rectifier directs energy, but it can only handle so much before things start happening, like frying insulation, burning out contacts, or overwhelming the reverse direction resistance of diodes. But the amount of energy direction remains the same until system failure. It's the rate of energy input that's causing a problem here.
But you will never get an increase in complexity or intelligence without the input from a greater intelligence.
I would like to counter with tornadoes, which are highly complex weather phenomena that can do immense amounts of work, and which are, as far as we can tell, not intelligently designed. In fact, tornadoes actually have a few things in common with life. For one thing, they are self-organizing. Tornadoes form from pressure fronts in clouds, and complex organisms grow from a single cell. And both organize themselves as they develop, both take advantage of energy gradients, whether it be thermal or chemical, and reduce those gradients faster than if they did not exist. In fact, both life and tornadoes are systems that increase entropy by feeding on energy gradients in ways that are perfectly in line with the laws of thermodynamics. And the fact that if you take either in isolation, they do not follow the second law of thermodynamics, because both do not have to increase in entropy over time, because both have inputs of energy that they are taking advantage of. And both end up dying out when that source of energy goes away or the structure that allowed them to take advantage of that energy source is sufficiently disrupted.
And simply adding undirected excess energy to a system will destroy the system. It will not benefit the system.
Again, that depends on a lot. It's not simply a rule that holds true in all cases. In fact, given that directed and undirected haven't even been defined in this context, it's not even a thought. It's just a collection of words intended to trick the audience.
So the addition of excess undirected energy will accomplish nothing beneficial. It will just destroy the previously existing system. You will never get a beneficial increase in intelligence or complexity without the input from a greater intelligence.
A point that hasn't even been argued for. Let's bring this back to genetics for a bit. For this to work as a genetic barrier to beneficial mutations, McMurtry would have to show that some mutations are thermodynamically dependent and that others are not, and that which ones are and are not changes with environment in such a way that beneficial mutations always require a violation of the laws of thermodynamics. Now, DNA replication is accomplished with the use of chemical energy, as are virtually all cellular processes. The breakup of adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate releases energy which drives DNA replication. This is also the energy that is used up when a mutation occurs, which in many cases doesn't actually take more energy than the mutation not occurring. So for this to make sense, some mutations would have to do something like cause the amount of available chemical energy in the cell to go up without taking any new matter or energy into the cell, and which ones do would have to depend on which mutations would be beneficial in the environment. But mutations don't just add energy to the cell, they reduce it. In that, DNA replication as a whole uses energy. Further, what mechanism could possibly predict whether a mutation will be beneficial, such that it would change the energy balance of the DNA replication? See, none of this makes even the first bit of sense. It relies on this idea that entropy means chaos, when it just doesn't, along with a fundamental lack of understanding of the fitness value of mutations being conditional and varying rather than fixed and non-conditional.
Again, why can't mutations produce evolutionary ascent? Well, mutations affect and are affected by many genes and other intergenic information acting in combination with one another. It is absolutely simplistic and false to believe that a gene controls a function. That's not true. Genes work in combination, along with pseudogenes, retroviruses, all kinds of things.
That's true.
This is true. Very few genes affect only one thing. That's why the light fur version of the agouti gene in mice can result in non-viable mice when it's homozygous. Because clearly it's affecting more than just how much melanin is in the fur, which on its own would not be fatal. Which we can see because albino mice exist and can grow to reproductive age and reproduce, all without any melanin. But the thing is that the fitness of an organism is basically the sum of the fitness effects of all their genes, then affected by what randomness exists in the environment. But in large enough populations, that randomness tends to even out, and what's left tends to be a largely natural selection based on the summed fitness effects. So if a mutation makes an animal better at getting food but also easier for predators to catch, whether it's beneficial depends on whether the greater reward outweighs the greater risk. If it does, then it's beneficial and will spread. If it doesn't, it's detrimental and it won't. The fact that genes interact and affect more than one trait isn't news to evolutionary biologists.
The addition of the accidental duplication of previously existing information is detrimental.
Well, that's certainly a take. Allow me to introduce you to the notothenaoid icefish from Antarctica. You see, this lineage of fish has an antifreeze glycoprotein that allows them to live in waters that are so cold that most other fish would have the water in their cells start to freeze, turning into jagged ice crystals with more volume than the water they formed from. You probably don't need it explained to you why jagged crystals rupturing your cells is bad for you. So how did these fish get such a handy protein? Well, they had a duplication of part of their trypsinogen gene, which after duplication then went on to further mutate to become an antifreeze protein. So while duplication on its own isn't going to help much, it can make duplicate or partial duplicate genes that can then go on to acquire new functions while leaving the original gene intact. This seems like it would be adding information under any definition that matters.
I'll prove that a little later.
Sure you will, buddy.
But think with me. The accidental duplication of previously existing information being added into a system is detrimental to the system.
Yeah, it's not like you might want more than one amylase gene so that multiple tissue types can express it and thereby significantly increase the caloric value of starchy foods. Oh wait, that's exactly what humans do. Darn. Interestingly enough, it's also what domesticated and feral dogs do, but not wolves. And creationists acknowledge that dogs are derived from wolves, which means that even in creation land, this is an example of gene duplication occurring and being beneficial, and of course it's beneficial because dogs eat a diet much more like the diet of humans than wolves, and therefore it's much heavier in starch than a wolf diet. So they developed salivary amylase, just like humans, but had to do it based on a wolf genome that had no such gene, and their salivary amylase gene is just a duplicate of one of their other amylase genes that they have. Evolution sure is neat, and easily demonstrable, isn't it?
Mutations are random, they are not directed, they are not beneficial.
I wonder if he'll ever actually try to justify that statement in a way that doesn't violate the basic laws of logic and rises to the actual level of coherent thought. That would be a nice improvement.
And why can't mutations produce evolutionary descent? Well, random mutations produce microevolution. Now, microevolution is the little tiny changes. They're simply shifts in a gene pool, right or left. Microevolution is the reason that no two of us look exactly alike. But microevolution is not macroevolution. Micro, just variation within a kind. Macro, supposedly the jump from one kind to another kind.
Okay, everybody say it with me now. What's a kind? And yeah, it's a really important question, because evolution isn't about saltatory leaps, where radically new organisms form. I know you've probably heard me go through this before, so I'll take a different path than going through the human lineages. Let's go with frogs. Well, the first uniconts that evolved were still eukaryotes. When the first opisthocons evolved, they were still uniconts. When the first metazoans evolved, they were still uniconts. When the first eumetazoans evolved, they were still metazoans. When the first bilaterians evolved, they were still bilaterians. When the first deuterostomes evolved, they were still bilaterians. When the first chordates evolved, they were still deuterostomes. When the first vertebrates evolved, they were still chordates. When the first osteichthyans evolved, they were still vertebrates. When the first sarcopterygians evolved, they were still osteichthyans. When the first stegocephalians evolved, they were still sarcopterygians. When the first tetrapods evolved, they were still stegocephalians. When the first lissamphibians evolved, they were still tetrapods. When the first anurans evolved, they were still lissamphibians. At no point is an organism's ancestry just left behind so it can jump into some new group that isn't part of the same clade as it was in previously. So what options do we have for defining clades? Well, we could define it based on morphology, but there's no obvious barrier that prevents morphology from changing beyond a certain degree. In fact, one of creationists' favorite groups of animals, the domesticated dog, shows that pretty darn conclusively, with the wild array of morphology that they've managed to have in just the last few centuries of breeding. This probably won't work since there's no definite amount of morphological change that creationists could point to. More intellectually consistent definition might be that a kind is a group of organisms that do not share universal common ancestry with any other group of organisms. Of course, the problem here is just that universal common ancestry just becomes the claim that there is only one kind, and then suddenly evolution doesn't involve the evolution of new kinds or changes in kind. So yeah, if creationists want to use a change in kinds being impossible as an objection to evolution, they have a lot of work to do to actually make it a real thought, never mind a problem scientists should grapple with.
But microevolution is just variation within a kind.
Actually, it's evolution below the species level. Once speciation has occurred, it's macroevolution, because kind isn't a term in science.
It's why dogs look different, people look different, but they're still dogs, they're still people. And microevolution, which is only variation with a kind, cannot produce macroevolution.
Except that once you have enough microevolution in a particular group, you get a new species. And that's what macroevolution is. Unless McMurtry wants to show why speciation can't happen, even though it's been observed in real time both in the lab and in nature, then microevolution absolutely can and does lead to macroevolution.
Evolutionists cannot adequately answer the question, where did the original information that is being copied come from?
Well, even if we had a good definition for information in this case, and it were true that with that science didn't have a good explanation for where the first of it came from, so what? You can know who your grandparents are without knowing where your 40 times great-grandparents came from. Similarly, you can tell a car lost traction on an icy patch of the road and drove into a ditch if you find it that way without knowing where the car was coming from. The inability of science to know the origin of a thing says nothing about its ability to describe that thing or even its history up to a point.
I have defeated major evolutionists in debate.
Citation needed.
Simply by saying, please tell me, Professor so-and-so, where did the information we are copying come from? Because you've got to copy previously existing information, either perfectly or imperfectly.
That's right. You can't explain a car crash unless you know where the car came from. Oh wait. Nope. That's dumb. That's not how anything works.
And no one has ever given me an answer to this question that will then prove that evolution is true.
Well, science doesn't prove things, and expecting it to makes you sound like a flat earther, which really is only different from young Earth creationism in terms of funding and how long it's been non-viable.
Finally, on this point, since 1910, we've done over 3,000 mutations that have been documented in fruit flies, yet there is no documentation of a fruit fly evolving into something else.
Right, because a fruit fly evolving to not be a fruit fly would violate one of those basic aspects of evolution, that it's about branching within already established clades. If fruit flies evolved into something that wasn't a fruit fly, it would fundamentally disconfirm evolution. It would almost certainly be a miracle.
We have done things to fruit flies that ought to be illegal. We have hit them with x-rays, We've hit them with toxic chemicals. We've hit them with the heel of our shoe. We've done things to fruit flies that just ought to be illegal, immoral, and unethical. But the fact of the matter is, we've produced over 3,000 documented specific variations or mutations in the fruit flies. But they've never changed anything else.
Right, because that's how evolution works.
I mean, we have absolutely done things that are just cruel. I mean, we've had legs grow out through the middle of eyes. We've had, we've had fruit flies with short wings, curly wings, no wings. I mean, what do you call a fly with no wings? A crawl?
A stolen joke.
They got flies with no wings at all. What do you call that? A crawl or a walk? Can't fly.
Let's think about this.
That'd be a first for Grady here.
This is a normal fruit fly here. This is a fly with curly wings, but it can't fly. This is one with short wings, but it can't fly. And of course, one without wings can't fly either. And I'd like to share a quotation from the great evolutionist Pierre-Paul Grosset. Now, he's at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He wrote a book called Evolution of Living Organisms that was published in 1977.
Nearly half a century ago. Great. Do you think creationists know that science is still happening in present year? They seem not to.
In that book, he said this, quote, "The fruit fly, the favorite pet insect of the geneticists, whose geographical, biotopical, urban, and rural genotypes are now known inside and out, seems not to have changed since the remotest times."
Cool. There is no minimum pace for morphological change in evolution. Stabilizing selection occurs when an organism is well adapted to its current niche and the fitness landscape for that organism is relatively stable. That this is the case for the fruit fly is neither surprising nor a problem for science.
Well, he's just said, in spite of everything we know, every mutation we've made, we've never changed fruit flies into anything else. Not in nature, not in the laboratory.
Actually, it doesn't seem like he said that. It seems more likely that he was talking about the history, not the present, of fruit flies. But then his book isn't publicly available, neither is it a peer-reviewed work, nor was it taken seriously by basically anyone. And why is this? Because Pierre-Paul Grosset was basically the last of the neo-Lamarckists. He was essentially a pseudoscientist by the time this book was written. The only people I can find citing him for anything are creationists, and they all are openly just getting this quotation from Frank Sherwin. He's one of the morons in my series, Amazing Animals, Obvious Evolution. Near as I can tell, this is a quote mine from a highly dubious source.
Now, this is a biology textbook from 1996. In there is the electron microphotograph here of a fruit fly. But this fruit fly is interesting because it has a mutation with an extra pair of wings. Okay, so these are the regular wings here, but it has an extra pair of wings back there. Now, here's the thing. One evolutionist said, well, you know, the extra pair of wings would allow the fruit fly to fly at higher elevations. Fruit flies would be able to survive above 7,000 feet of elevation.
Who said that? When? And in what publication? I think it was no one, because dipterans lost the ability to control their rear wings for flight after turning them into halteres that are used as sensory organs to keep flight stability when flying with the anterior wings. I think McMurtry just made this up because he's a liar.
The problem with that, of course, is that no fruit fly lives above 7,000 feet of elevation because they all freeze to death.
No. The problem is that this is not something anyone said, because notice how he's happy to cite sources when he has one, but for this it's just one evolutionist. Yeah, that's not a citation. You know, one creationist once told me that God isn't real, evolution totally happened, and that anyone who believes in Noah is actually a liar and a thief. Guess that proves it. Time for all the creationists to go home. Oh wait, you don't believe me? Why, how could that be? I mean, I told you one creationist said it. That should be enough authority.
And this fly cannot fly. It can only hop.
I don't think it can even hop, because flies don't hop. They walk, or crawl if you want to use that word.
And no normal fruit fly will mate with it.
I'd like to see that citation too. Weird how we just kind of abandon the idea that we should have citations, isn't it?
Well, so would this mutation be passed on in nature? Well, obviously not.
Yeah, it wouldn't, and no one has ever claimed that every mutation would be. This is like saying that cats don't exist because you own a dog. Finding an example of a non-cat doesn't mean cats don't exist.
Now, in the textbook, it says this: normal fruit flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4, as clearly seen on the picture. The textbook then says this rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful.
Which is wrong, because most mutations are, in fact, neither harmful nor beneficial. They are neutral.
So even the textbook admits most mutations are harmful, although actually all are harmful.
Yes, the mutations in the E. coli in the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment that allowed them to metabolize citrate in the presence of oxygen, thereby leading to a significant increase in fitness, were harmful to those bacteria. No, wait, they were actually very beneficial. Whoops.
And then it says this in a very optimistic tone: Beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Well, here we're taking a look at survival of the fittest, but, well, let's think for a second.
He said that before and proceeded to not think. I'm not holding out much hope for this time.
This is not macroevolution. This is the accidental duplication of previously existing information. Is that correct? I mean, the information for wings already existed. Is that correct? This is just the accidental duplication of previously existing information.
Well, first, no one to my knowledge is claiming that this is macroevolution. Why would someone do that? This isn't a new species, so of course it's microevolution at best. But also, no, it's not a duplication of information. It's actually the loss of function of the Hox gene, ultrabithorax, which modifies the development of the second of the 3 thoracic segments into a smaller segment, bearing the halt ears, that allow the fly to balance. So without this Hox gene, the embryonic fly falls back on the default development, which is normally only expressed in the first thoracic segment. This really isn't hard to find out either, and it really doesn't harm Grady's argument. He just chose to not bother finding out if he's right or not. Once again, I ask the creationists who might be watching this, does it bother you that creationists so often just don't actually care to look into the claims they make and simply assume that their understanding of a field is adequate, despite often being obviously inadequate? What do you think accounts for this? Could it be that the position they take is broadly wrong? After all, people who know what they're talking about and are right tend not to make basic mistakes so ubiquitously.
It's not beneficial. It's lethal.
If it were actually lethal, you couldn't just get images of the fly, because it would have failed to develop into a living imago. It might be highly detrimental in most environments, but that's not the same thing.
And let's talk about vestigial organs. Now, Charles Darwin considered the existence of vestigial organs to be an absolutely essential proof to evolution.
For the 4th time, not proof. He considered it an important piece of evidence. Science doesn't do proof.
Now, what are vestigial and retrogressive organs?
That's a good question, and it's important to note that they're not the same thing. A vestigial organ is one that is homologous with the organs of other animals that perform some function, but that in the organism in question no longer performs that function. An example might be the wing of an ostrich. It clearly shares the anatomy and basic form of a wing with other birds, but while in most birds the basic function of the wing is to generate lift and thrust to allow flight, in ostriches it does not do this, and so is vestigial. A retrogressive organ is one that is simplified compared to the ancestral trait. For example, tunicates have lost most of the organs that typify chordates as an adult, lacking a notochord and even a brain. But one might also say that a horse leg is retrogressive in that it has gone from having 5 toes to only 1, and therefore is simple compared to the legs of most tetrapods. But it is certainly not vestigial because it retains the normal basic function of tetrapod legs, that is, locomotion. It is important also to note that neither retrogressive organs nor vestigial ones must lack function in order to be either. They must simply be simplified in the case of retrogressive organs, or no longer retain the function of the original organ in the case of vestigial organs.
Well, vestigial means useless, no longer needed. Retrogressive means it was needed, but at the moment it's kind of on the way out.
Why is he so aggressively wrong about basically everything? How could this man be telling the truth about growing up learning evolutionary biology at Berkeley and then teaching it for years, when he evidently knows less about the subject than the average 14-year-old?
Vestigial, no longer needed, useless. Retrogressive, was once useful, now still partly useful, but on the way out.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
Wrong from start to end. Amazing. This bodes ill for any arguments he'll try to make based on the existence of these organisms.
And Charles Darwin said that this was an essential proof of evolution.
I wonder where he said that. It sure would be nice if we got a citation.
His reasoning went like this. He said, if an organ or a structure was still in a human being, that was also in an ape, and the structure was still useful in an ape, but was no longer useful in a human being, it proved that we had evolved past being apes, and we were now evolving into something new, some kind of a superhuman. And so these organs and structures that were no longer needed were phasing out, and new things were evolving. I mean, that's his concept.
Yeah, that's something Grady just made up. That argument is not anywhere that I can find in Darwin's work. But heck, let's just read what he said about the subject. This is from chapter 14 and is the section called Rudimentary, Atrophied, and Aborted Organs. Organs or parts in this strange condition, bearing the plain stamp of inutility, are extremely common, or even general throughout nature. It would be impossible to name one of the higher animals in which some part or other is not in a rudimentary condition. In the mammalia, for instance, the males possess rudimentary mammae. In snakes, one lobe of the lungs is rudimentary. In birds, the bastard wing may safely be considered as a rudimentary digit. And in some species, the whole wing is so far rudimentary that it cannot be used for flight. What can be more curious than the presence of teeth in fetal whales, which when grown up, have not a tooth in their heads, or the teeth which never cut through the gums in the upper jaws of unborn calves? Rudimentary organs plainly declare their origin and meaning in various ways. There are beetles belonging to closely allied species, or even to the same identical species, which have either full-size and perfect wings or mere rudiments of membrane, which not rarely lie under wing covers firmly soldered together. And in these cases, it is impossible to doubt that the rudiments represent wings. Rudimentary organs sometimes retain their potentiality. This occurs naturally with the mammae of male mammals, which have been known to become well-developed and to secrete milk. So again, in the udders of the genus Bos, there are normally 4 developed and 2 rudimentary teeth. But the latter in our domesticated cows sometimes become well-developed and yield milk. In regards to plants, the petals are sometimes rudimentary and sometimes well-developed in the individuals of the same species. In certain plants having separated sexes, Kohlreuter found that by crossing a species, in which the male flowers included a rudiment of a pistil, with a hermaphrodite species, having of course a well-developed pistil, the rudiment in the hybrid offspring was much decreased in size, and this clearly shows that the rudimentary and perfect pistils are essentially alike in nature. An animal may possess various parts in a perfect state, and yet they may in one sense be rudimentary, for they are useless. Thus the tadpole of the common salamander, or water newt, as Mr. G.H. Lewes remarks, has gills and passes its existence in the water, but Salamandra atra, which lives high up among the mountains, brings forth its youth fully formed. This animal never lives in the water. Yet if we open a gravid female, we find tadpoles inside her with exquisitely feathered gills, and when placed in the water, they swim about like the tadpoles of the water newt. Obviously, this aquatic organization has no reference to the future life of the animal, nor has it any adaptation to its embryonic condition. It has solely reference to ancestral adaptations. It repeats a phase of the development of its progenitors. An organ serving for 2 purposes may become rudimentary or utterly aborted for one, even the more important purpose, and remain perfectly efficient for the other. Thus in plants, the office of the pistil is to allow the pollen tubes to reach the ovules within the ovarium. The pistil consists of a stigma supported on the style, but in some Compositae, the male florets, which of course cannot be fecundated, have a rudimentary pistil. For it is not crowned with stigma, but the style remains well developed and is clothed in the usual manner with hairs, which serve to brush pollen out of the surrounding and conjoined anthers. Again, an organ may become rudimentary for its proper purpose and be used for a distinct one. In certain fishes, the swim bladder seems to be rudimentary for its proper function of giving buoyancy, but has become converted into a nascent breathing organ or lung. Many similar instances could be given. Useful organs, however little they may be developed, unless we have reason to suppose that they were formerly more highly developed, ought not to be considered as rudimentary. They may be in a nascent condition and in progress towards further development. Rudimentary organs, on the other hand, are either quite useless, such as teeth which never cut through the gums, or almost useless, such as the wings of an ostrich, which serve merely as sails. As organs in this condition would formerly, when still less developed, have been of even less use than at present, they cannot formerly have been produced through the variation and natural selection, which acts solely by the preservation of useful modifications. They have been partially retained by the power of inheritance and relate to a former state of things. It is, however, often difficult to distinguish between rudimentary and nascent organs, for we can judge only by analogy whether a part is capable of further development, in which case alone it deserves to be called nascent. Organs in this condition will always be somewhat rare, for being thus provided will commonly have been supplanted by their succession with the same organ in a more perfect state, and consequently will have become long ago extinct. The wing of the penguin is of high service, acting as a fin. It may therefore represent the nascent state of the wing. Not that I believe this to be the case. It is more probably a reduced organ, modified for a new function. The wing of Apteryx, on the other hand, is quite useless and is truly rudimentary. Owen considers the simple filamentary limbs of a lepidosiren as the beginnings of organs which attain a fully functional development in higher vertebrates, but according to the view lately advocated by Dr. Gunther, they are probably remnants consisting of the persistent axis of a fin with lateral rays or branches aborted. The mammary glands of Ornithorhynchus may be considered in comparison with the udders of a cow as in a nascent condition. The ovigerous frena of certain cirripedes, which have ceased to give attachment to the ova and are feebly developed, are nascent branchiae. Rudimentary organs in individuals of the same species are very liable to vary in the degree of their development and in other respects. In closely allied species also, the extent to which the same organ has been reduced occasionally differs much. This latter fact is well exemplified in the state of the wings of female moths belonging to the same family. Rudimentary organs may be utterly aborted, and this applies that in certain animals or plants, parts are entirely absent, which analogy would lead us to expect to find in them, and which are occasionally found in monstrous individuals. Thus, in most of the Scrophulariaceae, the 5th stamen is utterly aborted, and yet we may conclude that a 5th stamen once existed, for a rudiment of it is found in many places of the family, and this rudiment occasionally becomes perfectly developed, as may sometimes be seen in the common snapdragon. In tracing the homologies of any part in different members of the same class, nothing is more common, or in order fully to understand the relations of the parts more useful than the discovery of rudiments. This is well shown in the drawings given by Owen of the leg bones of the horse, ox, and rhinoceros. It is an important fact that rudimentary organs such as teeth in the upper jaws of whales and remnants can often be detected in embryo but afterwards wholly disappear. It is also, I believe, a universal rule that a rudimentary part is of greater size in embryo relative to the adjoining parts than in the adults, so that the organ at this early stage is less rudimentary or even cannot be said to be in any degree rudimentary. Hence, rudimentary organs in the adult are often said to have retained their embryonic condition. I have now given the leading facts with respect to rudimentary organs. In reflecting on them, everyone must be struck with astonishment. The same reasoning power which tells us that most parts and organs are exquisitely adapted for certain purposes tells us with equal plainness that these rudimentary or atrophied organisms are imperfect and useless. In works on natural history, rudimentary organs are generally said to have been created for the sake of symmetry, or in order to complete the scheme of nature. But this is not an explanation, merely a restatement of the fact, nor is it consistent with itself. Thus, the boa constrictor has rudiments of hind limbs and of a pelvis, and if it be said that these bones have been retained to complete the schema of nature, why, as Professor Wiseman asks, have they not been retained by other snakes which do not possess even a vestige of these same bones? What would be thought of the astronomer who maintained that the satellites revolve in elliptic orbits round their planets for the sake of symmetry, because the planets thus revolve around the sun? An eminent physiologist accounts for the presence of rudimentary organs by supposing that they serve to excrete matter in excess, or matter injurious to the system. But can we suppose that minute papillae, which are often present in the pistil of male flowers, and which is formed of mere cellular tissue, can thus act? Can we suppose that rudimentary teeth, which are subsequently absorbed, are beneficial to rapidly growing embryonic calf by removing matter so precious as phosphate of lime? When a man's fingers have been amputated, imperfect nails have been known to appear on the stumps, and it could be assumed believed that these vestiges of nails are developed in order to excrete horny matter, as that the rudimentary nails on the fin of the manatee have been developed for the same purpose. On the view of descent with modification, the origins of rudimentary organs is comparatively simple, and we can understand to a large extent the laws governing their imperfect development. We have plenty of cases of rudimentary organs in our domestic products, such as the stump of tail in tailless breeds, the vestige of an ear in earless breeds of sheep, and the reappearance of minute dangling horns in hornless breeds of cattle, more especially, according to Watt, in young animals, and in the state of the whole flower and the cauliflower. We often see rudiments of various parts in monsters, but I doubt whether any of these cases throw light on the origin of rudimentary organs in a state of nature, further than by showing that rudiments can be produced. For the balance of evidence clearly indicates that species under nature do not undergo great and abrupt changes, but we learn from the study of our domestic products that the disuse of parts leads to their reduced size, and that the result is inherited. It appears probable that disuse has been the main agent in rendering organs rudimentary. It would at first be led by slow steps to the more and more complete reduction of a part, until at last it became rudimentary, as in the case of the eyes of animals inhabiting dark caverns, and of the wings of birds inhabiting oceanic islands, which have seldom been forced by beasts of prey to take flight, and have ultimately lost the power of flying. Again, an organ useful under certain conditions might become injurious under others, as with the wings of beetles living on small and exposed islands, and in this case natural selection will have aided in reducing the organ until it was rendered harmless and rudimentary. Any change in structure and function which can be effected by small stages is within the power of natural selection, so that an organ rendered through changed habits of life useless or injurious for one purpose might be modified and used for another purpose. An organ might also be retained for one alone of its former functions. Organs originally formed by the aid of natural selection, when rendered useless, may well be variable, for their variations can no longer be checked by natural selection. All this agrees well with what we see under nature. Moreover, at whatever period of life either disuse or selection reduces an organ, and this will generally be when the being has come to maturity, and to exert its full powers of action, the principle of inheritance at corresponding ages will tend to reproduce the organ in its reduced state at the same mature age, but will seldom affect it in the embryo. Thus we can understand the greater size of rudimentary organs in the embryo relatively to adjoining parts, and their lesser relative size in the adult, if for instance the digit of an adult animal was used less and less during many generations owing to some change of habits, or if an organ or gland were less and less functionally exercised, we may infer that it would become reduced in size in the adult descendants of this animal, but would retain nearly its original size standard of development in embryo. There remains, however, this difficulty. After an organ has ceased being used and has become in correspondence much reduced, how can it be further still reduced in size until the merest vestige is left? And how can it be finally quite obliterated? It is scarcely possible that disuse can go on producing any further effect after the organ has been rendered functionless. Some additional explanation is here requisite which I cannot give. If, for instance, it could be proved that every part of the organization tends to vary in a greater degree towards diminution than towards augmentation of size, then we should be able to understand how an organ which has become useless would be rendered, independently of the effects of disuse, rudimentary, and the last would be wholly supposed, for the variations towards diminished size would no longer be checked by natural selection. The principle of economy of growth, explained in a former chapter, by which the materials forming any part, if not useful to the possessor, are saved as far as possible, will perhaps come into play in rendering a useless part rudimentary. But this principle will almost necessarily be confined to the earlier stages of the process of reduction. For we cannot suppose that a minute papilla, for instance, representing in a male flower the pistil of the female flower, and formed merely of cellular tissue, could be further reduced or absorbed for the sake of economizing nutriment. Finally, as rudimentary organs, by whatever steps they may have been dragged into their present useless condition, are the record of a former state of things, and have been retained solely through the power of inheritance, we can understand on the genealogical view of classification how it is that systematists, in placing organisms in their proper places in the natural system, have often found rudimentary parts as useful as, or even sometimes more useful than, parts of high physiological importance. Rudimentary organs may be compared with the letters in a word still retained in their spelling, but become useless in the pronunciation, but which serve as a clue for its derivation. On the view of descent with modification, we may conclude the existence of organs in a rudimentary, imperfect, and useless condition, or quite aborted, far from presenting a strange difficulty, as they assuredly do in the old doctrine of creation, might even have been anticipated in accordance with the views explained here. Isn't it odd how Darwin doesn't actually seem to say what Grady says he says? And of course what Darwin said is only of historical interest, because Darwin is not the Pope, he's not a prophet, and he's not a god. He's just a scientist who got some things right and some things wrong. In fact, he got the idea that the bastard wing of birds is useless wrong. That structure, which is made of the distalmost phalange of the thumb, reduces stall speed, allowing birds to land safely at low speed.
Now, I want to introduce you to Dr. Vidisham. In 1895, Dr. Vidisham, who was an evolutionary believing anatomist, wrote a book called The Structure of Man.
Oh no, a man in 1895 got some things wrong, and so now science is stuck with them, here nearly 130 years later. Oh wait. No, it's not. It just updates when new data came in. It's that thing that makes science more trustworthy than pseudoscience, the willingness to change when it turns out something is wrong. As we've seen in this series, though, creationists apparently, by and large, don't care about being wrong, or are just too intellectually dishonest to notice when they are.
In that book, he listed 186 organs or structures in the human body. There was 100 vestigial, no longer needed, and 86 retrogressive, partially useful, but on the way out.
Which, again, isn't what those words mean, not even to Darwin.
In the book, he listed the pituitary gland. Now, first of all, if I take out your pituitary gland, you're going to die. He also listed the pineal gland, tonsils, wisdom teeth, human hair, small toes, coccyx, thymus gland, notochord, appendix, well, and the little gland in your eye that produces sleep. He listed as just some of the 186. Now, for instance, if you don't think you don't need small toes, we'll be very happy to amputate them on the way out from the presentation.
Humans don't need their small toes. In fact, a human can lose any toe and be back to normal in about 2 months, with most of the adjustment and healing being accomplished in the first 3 or 4 weeks. It's not unusual for a human to be back to their normal routine within 4 weeks of the amputation of a toe. That being said, I can't imagine why someone would opt to go through with the recovery of surgery just to prove a point to Grady. You also don't need any given hair, and hairs fall out all the time. This doesn't mean that Grady would let me pull at his hair just to prove that he doesn't need one of them. This is far more serious than that.
And you will have to learn how to walk all over again from scratch.
Nope, you won't. In fact, a toe amputation doesn't even normally require physical therapy. Once the wound is healed, you'll be walking just fine in virtually all cases. Toe amputation is even considered a minor surgery.
Well, let's think here for a second.
He keeps saying that, but then making no apparent effort to actually do that thinking.
What about the appendix? I mean, you've all heard the appendix is a useless, functionless organ that don't need it and so forth.
Well, you don't need it. People routinely live long, healthy lives without it, but it does have a few functions, as I'm sure we're about to hear about.
As a matter of fact, in this biology textbook here, it compares a human to a horse for some reason. I'm not sure why, but...
Because in a horse, the appendix is used to help digest tough plant matter, and at the time it was printed in 1994, it was thought the appendix in mammals was widely homologous. Turns out that doesn't seem to be the case, with more recent studies, such as multiple independent appearances of the cecal appendix in mammalian evolution, and an investigation of related ecological and anatomical factors, Smith et al. 2013, and morphological evolution of mammalian cecum and cecal appendix, Smith et al. 2017. Once again, science adapting to new evidence and becoming better. Grady should take notes.
Notice it says, compared with the cecum of a horse, the appendix of humans is thought to be vestigial, no longer needed. But this comes from a book called Fully Functional by Dr. Jerry Bergman. And, quote, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. As a matter of fact, today we now know that the immune system in babies is highly dependent upon the appendix.
Well, first, New Scientist is not a peer-reviewed source, and neither is the textbook Grady was referencing. Second, I have not been able to find this article online, even behind the New Scientist paywall. The only places I can see it being cited are Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International, neither of which link to an online version. Oddly, the CMI article quotes from an article that has a different number from the one they cite, and that does exist, but does not contain the quotation McMurtry is using. In the article I could find, it does quote Johann Uys as saying, in humans it was thought to have no physiological function. However, it is now known to play a role in fetal immunity and in young adults. During the early years of development, the appendix functions as a lymphoid organ, assisting with the maturation of B lymphocytes, a type of white blood cell, and in the production of immunoglobulin A antibodies. In addition, at around the 11th week of fetal development, endocrine, hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. These cells produce peptide hormones that control various biological mechanisms. I have no idea who this is, other than a South African man who is, for some reason, writing for New Scientist. Further, searching for the exact wording McMurtry used brings up articles about the appendix, but none that contain the exact wording. I suspect that exact wording does not actually exist anywhere, and that this is another instance of the well-known phenomenon of creationists getting quotations badly wrong, and then other creationists just copying the bad quotation and citation without ever bothering to check the original source. All this being said, I can't find much to confirm that the appendix is especially important for fetal development, but I also don't find that claim very extraordinary, and so unless I can find something more, I don't really plan to dispute it.
Notice that this is from New Scientist, an evolutionary publication.
Well, so he says. Again, I can't find that exact phrasing anywhere, and other citations with exactly the same sources he's using link to an article that doesn't say that. But yes, New Scientist doesn't, as far as I can tell, generally support pseudoscience such as flat earth, homeopathy, geocentrism, dowsing, or young earth creationism.
During fetal development, and endocrine hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. So during fetal development, endocrine hormone-producing cells appear in the appendix. These cells produce peptide hormones that control various biological functions.
That does seem to be true, and it's news to me. It looks like it's been confirmed a few times, but again, this isn't terribly surprising, as we now know that rather than being a widely distributed plesiomorphic trait of primates, the appendix is a conversion feature and probably not vestigial, because it was probably never used for the fermentation of rough plant matter. After this, he makes a citation to a Dr. Ron Allard. I have no idea who that is, nor can I seem to find him, and then Walt Brown. Yes, that Walt Brown. Of lunar bukkake fame. Anyway, because I do not dispute that the appendix is not well characterized as vestigial, I'm not sure what the point is.
And what about, the coccyx? Now, people incorrectly call the coccyx a tailbone. Well, it's not a tailbone.
Yeah, but is it though? So here's a human embryo with a tail. A tail is just an extension of the spine posterior to the anus. And that's what this is. It's also the tissue from which the coccyx grows. So the coccyx absolutely is a tailbone. In fact, it technically is the tail in a human. It just is internal after a very small amount of embryonic development.
Has nothing to do with a tail. Never did, never will.
I can't with this guy anymore. He's much too dumb.
And, well, here's a picture of the supposed tailbone, though that's not what it is at all. It's actually a very cleverly designed structure.
It's a tailbone, even if it's cleverly designed. Which it's not, but whatever.
But in Discover magazine, June 2004, they said this, that it's all that's left of the tail that most mammals still use. Well, first of all, it was never a tail, and it isn't today. And here's another biology textbook. Notice here it says, humans have a tailbone with no apparent use.
Oh no, a biology textbook for babies from almost 3.5 decades ago got it slightly wrong because the coccyx is indeed used as an anchor point for some muscles. Whatever shall we do? Besides, I don't know, maybe stop looking at texts for babies and see what the state of the field in current year is? And look, I'm not happy with how out-of-date textbooks are, and I do not think that science education in the United States is doing as good a job as it should. But this guy isn't a school teacher, and he's certainly not a school child. He's talking to adults, and he should be using real sources.
And then the textbook says, vestigial tailbones in humans. These vestigial structures can be viewed as evidence for evolution. Organisms having vestigial structures probably share a common ancestor. That's evolution.
Yep.
Or from this biology textbook, again concerning the coccyx or tailbone.
Oh, this one is slightly less old. Neato.
It has no present function. Remainder of bones, long tail but free dwelling ancestor. They want to make people just monkeys or apes. Actually, Charles Darwin said people evolved from monkeys. People will say he meant apes. I don't know whether he meant it or not, but he wrote monkeys.
Well, people are monkeys and apes, although I'm not sure why we need to add just in front of it, as if being a monkey or an ape were some lowly or embarrassing thing. Look, what do I know? I'm a ceratosaurus. I bite the heads off of sauropods. But even not I'm such a gigantic dick as to say that monkeys suck for no reason. Monkeys are cool. But anyway, with that monkey business done, I think it's as good a time as any to pause in this series. I hope you've had fun watching. I certainly had something while making this. A headache might be what. But oh well. If you liked this video, hit like and let me know in the comments what you liked. If you didn't, hit dislike and tell me why not in the comments. Either way, please remember to subscribe and use the bell icon to turn on all notifications, so you're always alerted when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Benthoven, Tapioca Weasel, Danny5252, Eleron Teller, Furavara, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babby, San, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bead, Scriptic Mystic, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, and Pat L. Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if an annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.
Well,